never ends. Hi everyone, Juicing World Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for another edition of our Worst to Best series, where I go through the studio album catalog of a major recording artist, and I rank their albums from worst to best. In this video, I'm going to be going over the 8 album catalog of the band Talking Heads. They are a band that formed in New York in the mid-70s, broke up in 1991, I believe. They made a pretty significant impact on the worlds of punk, rock, dance, and pop music. For the entirety of their studio album catalog, the group held on to 4 core members: guitarist, lyricist, and singer David Byrne, bassist Tina Weymouth, drummer Chris France, and guitarist Jerry Harrison. Or these are at least the roles that you would see each member playing if they were performing live. Each member of the band was kind of a multi-instrumentalist in their own right, contributing an array of sounds and musical ideas across the band's discography. Talking Heads was also one of the rare instances of a band with roots in the New York punk scene going on to achieve mainstream success through the rise of New Wave, though they were always kind of an oddball in whatever musical trend they may have been inadvertently surfing, fusing way too many genres together to be snugly fit into one musical category, whether it be the fusion of punk, funk, and disco on their earlier releases, or the sounds of Afrobeat, salsa, and Latin pop that would turn up on their later albums. Talking Heads were also notorious for their high-energy, larger-than-life, and creatively staged live shows. The band's live albums actually stand as some of their most significant releases, and Stop Making Sense is considered to be one of the greatest live albums and concert films of all time. So if you'd like to hear any of the material on these albums that I'm about to talk about in a new light, I highly suggest checking out those live records. Stop Making Sense, and the name of this band is Talking Heads. If the band is completely new to you, I might even suggest to try those records first. All that being said though, here's the list. Yeah, I pretty much think Talking Heads' worst album is their final album, their 1988 record, Naked. And no, not just because this is a hideously tacky album cover. My dislike for this record is for a couple of reasons. I mean, at this point, I can kind of hear the band's personality fracturing, their identity fading as David Byrne's new obsession with salsa and Latin pop is kind of overtaking the sound of the band's new songs. Bringing on foreign music influences isn't necessarily a bad thing, of course. Talking Heads already pulled it off beautifully on their album Remain in Light with the sounds of Afrobeat. But on Naked, it doesn't feel like there is as much pressure to incorporate it into their sound creatively or put their own spin on it. And maybe to a degree they do, but it feels almost like an inadvertent twist, meaning that it sounds like David Byrne and company were trying their best to recreate the Latin and tropical sounds on this album, authentically speaking, and then of course bring some societal critiques in the lyrics on tracks like Nothing But Flowers. But I don't think the result of the album really lived up to the vision, as the music doesn't sound like an authentic take on these styles of music. Instead, it comes off more like distended bellies and Hawaiian shirts and cargo shorts on an expensive cruise ship. There are also moments on this thing like The Facts of Life, which is a super ill-conceived foray into the sounds of industrial music. There's also the really dramatic and tedious Democratic Circus, or the song Big Daddy, which easily features some of David Byrne's worst lyrics of the 80s. Yeah, while it's not the worst album in the world, I wouldn't recommend anybody try it first. It's listenable, and I guess it's kind of intriguing to see what the band's last moments were like as far as the studio goes. Okay, so Talking Heads' second to worst album is their second to last album, in my opinion, their 1986 record, True Stories, which is really an odd album for Talking Heads because throughout their career they were always on the cutting edge, ahead of the curve, breaking the mold, sounded like no other group out there. But oddly enough, True Story sounds like Talking Heads playing catch up with New Wave and just embracing every pop and rock cliche of the 1980s, with all these gated drums and chunky guitar riffs and straightforward grooves. On a great deal of these tracks, even David Byrne's vocals seem a little less eccentric. That is, when he's not overdoing it on the incredibly obnoxious Wildlife, where he's kind of growling his brains out. Miraculously, this song was a kind of popular single, charting higher than a lot of the band's legendary singles up to that point, even Once in a Lifetime. So I guess there's something to be said for going with the flow, as this album might have been Talking Heads trying to maintain their new popularity after the smash successes of Stop Making Sense and Speaking in Tongues and Little Creatures. Plus, this album is also connected to the David Byrne film of the same name, in which Talking Heads band members give little cameo appearances. So maybe given that the songs were going to be connected to the film, David was trying to make them as straightforward, catchy, and as punchy as possible. I mean, I'm just guessing here. There's also the track Radiohead, which famously inspired the band Radiohead to name themselves Radiohead, which is a kind of quaint, high-gloss piece of popped-out ska, which could have easily landed on the Camper Van Beethoven album that dropped just a year before. The album is okay, but overall it just kind of sounds like Talking Heads are beginning to lose their identity and their sense of self on this one. Next, their 1985 album, Talking Heads' Little Creatures. Interestingly enough, their biggest selling album, in my opinion, is one of their least interesting. After an entire career so far of pushing boundaries and challenging norms, and sometimes even setting them, because in their side project Tom Tom Club, Chris and Tina did come together with some new wave bangers, some synth pop essentials. On Little Creatures, Talking Heads essentially settled down for a pretty plain and straightforward pop rock album, which incorporates elements of country on a few tracks here and there. Even though Little Creatures is by no means a terrible album, it still in a way marks the beginning of the end for Talking Heads. After the 1-2 combo of Speaking in Tongues and Stop Making Sense, it was almost like the band was at a loss as to where to go stylistically next. As a result, David and company kind of stripped things back to the barest of essentials on this one, instrumentally speaking. Not too much on this record in the way of dense layers of instrumentation, hard grooves, experimental, weird production. In a way, the band kind of goes back to the simplicity of their Talking Heads 77 record years and years ago, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as Byrne and the band are kind of standing on the merits of the songwriting they deliver on this album, which there are many good examples of, like And She Was and We're on the Road to Nowhere. Again, you kind of have that cute country number in the mix on this one, Creatures of Love, in which David Byrne addresses the topic of romance and forming a lifelong bond with somebody in the way that only someone as awkward as David Byrne could. There's some total duds on this thing, like Walk It Down, which features these awful farty synths working their way through this lumbering instrumental that is just absolutely hideous. But overall, it's not that bad. It's kind of a mixed bag. There's some great songs on here. Don't necessarily avoid it just because it's not considered to be one of the band's best. Next, we have the Talking Heads album More Songs About Buildings and Food, their 1978 record. Just a year after the band released their debut, in the time between these two records, Talking Heads gained the attention of one Brian Eno. They would go on to record 3 pretty cutting-edge albums with him. Obviously, this is the first of them. However, I think More Songs is the least interesting and the least cutting-edge of the 3, as the album just sounds like a slightly more polished version of the tense, punky dance rock sound Talking Heads were delivering just a year earlier. Sure, it's slightly more elevated and built out a little bit with some organs, some piano, splashes of effects that make things sound a little bit more alien, like on the track Warning Sign, or the robotic icy synths that kind of pluck their way throughout the track Found a Job. I like these minuscule additions to the band's sound quite a bit, but I can't help but see this album as just more of a transitional moment for Talking Heads, as pretty much every album they would drop immediately after would be far better produced, better written, much more adventurous. And some of my least favorite Talking Heads songs land on this album, at least my least favorite versions of them, as nearly every song on this album that also turns up on their live album, the name of this band is Talking Heads, I pretty much prefer the live version. The differences between the studio and live versions of tracks like Girls Want to Be with the Girls is just like night and day. The energy, the grooves, just the delivery, the performance. David Byrne is clearly in his fullest form. The track off this record, Artists Only, David Byrne's vocals are completely buried beneath the sour synthesizers and milky bass. Let me stress here that Talking Heads, in their heyday, were an incredibly awkward band. And this was kind of a selling point. It was a definite personality trait. Many of David Byrne's lyrics would delve into his own difficulties with expressing his humanity, not to mention his personal fixations on things like buildings and houses. This painful social awkwardness would manifest itself in the way David Byrne sang as well, and in the way the band's music moved. The sense of unease is deafening on albums like 77 and More Songs. Keep in mind, this album wouldn't even have a hit if not for Take Me to the River, which miraculously brought the album to gold status. And it's kind of strange because that track stands out like a sore thumb in a good way on the record, as it feels like one of the most natural and relaxed cuts on the entire album. And so does the closer, Big Country. I mean, generally the album doesn't sound as boxed into its own anxiety as it nears the finish. I think More Songs is still a pretty good album, even if the execution is kind of off. I still can't really think of many albums in the late 70s that sounded like this, and I can see why there are so many people out there who would rate it highly, but I just personally don't see the record as their best. Getting into the second half of this album, we have Talking Heads' debut record, 77. I was just talking about the awkwardness that pervades the album More Songs, and it's also here too in spades on 77. Even though over time, I did come to warm up to this album so much more, because the production on this one is pretty balanced and straightforward. It's also hard not to hear the incredible amount of potential in the fusion of dance music, rock music, and funk music that the band was working with at this point, straddling the mainstream and the underground in a way that few bands were around that time, and doing it with this unsettling performance style that would also set them apart from every other band. This album, strangely enough, is equal parts clunky and slick. The sound of the drums, the guitars, the bass, the vocals on this thing might have been slightly claustrophobic, but Talking Heads made up for that with great grooves, great tunes, and lots of personality. Just oodles of it, which mostly came in the form of David Byrne's very weird vocal mannerisms, where it mostly sounded like he was trying to feverishly contort himself into some normal portrayal of human emotion. The song Happy Day sounds like it's trying to express some genuine moment of joy, but instead with its erratic rhythms and David Byrne's yelpy singing, it feels like anything but. The song No Compassion is literally about the difficulty of accepting and understanding other people's feelings and points of view. And we also have David Byrne almost role-playing on this album too, on the single Psycho Killer, one of the most iconic rock songs of all time, where David Byrne can be heard lyrically indulging in these irrational thoughts and volatile behaviors. The lyrics on this thing sound like the ramblings of the criminally insane. Maybe the most genuinely thrilling and upbeat song on the entire record is the closing track, Pulled Up. Pull me up, 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 up. Quite possibly one of my favorite Talking Heads songs, hands down. Pretty much a track about being lifted up out of the emotional dumps by another person. Despite a couple of criticisms I have of the way this album sounds and vibes, generally I think 77 is an excellent album. A great start to the band's career. Solid from start to finish, lots of great songs on here, lots of great performances, even if they translated better on live albums. It's almost impenetrably uneasy, as well as endlessly compelling. It's as creepy as it is catchy, and I absolutely love it. Next, the 1979 album from Talking Heads, Fear of Music, the second full-length LP that the band would record with Brian Eno, and this album for the band saw a massive transition into basically a bigger sound, better production, slicker grooves, grander presentation, more overt references to musical styles hailing from West Africa, most notably on the song I Zimbra, which you can hear all over the congas of this track, the background vocals, some of the insane guitar licks on this cut too. Robert Fripp actually features on this song as well. Sadly, these are not musical influences you will hear in spades throughout the rest of the album. More consistently, they are explored on the band's next record, Remain in Light. That being said though, Fear of Music is still a really excellent album and pretty much embodies its title, as it sounds like David Byrne and company on this album are using music as a throughway to explore and express ideas about fear and the neurotic tendencies of the band in general. The dance grooves and the sickening unease of Talking Heads' typical sound on this album don't seem at odds as much as they've been in the past. It feels like they're informing one another now. And of course, I mean that in a very good way. There are cuts on this album like Cities, which are incredibly tense, but are still undeniably easy to dance to, as the bass and drumming on this track are fantastic. Meanwhile, David Byrne's manic ramblings about urban living are maddening. The instrumental is hustling, it's bustling, there are weird crunchy rhythm guitars all over this thing too. Some metallic clangs as well in the mix, there are some points of this album that feel almost vaguely industrial. The song Mind seems like a creepy and obsessive dive into the psyche of someone who can't let go of someone else's stubbornness, wondering if they can get drugs or science or religion to change this other person, or maybe David Byrne is making some kind of at-large societal critique too, which is most likely the case, as this is not his first time doing such a thing on record. I also love the squeaky guitars and the strained, ghastly background vocals on this cut too, the rubbery bass. There are also slow burner cuts on here that are a bit more ethereal and light on the ears, like the song Air, which miraculously ends up being pretty terrifying when you read into the lyrics of that cut. There's also the very pillowy Heaven. These cuts are easily two of the band's best ballads. The latter of the two show David Byrne's thoughts wandering in a refreshingly existential direction, where he's kind of waxing poetic about an afterlife. Heaven is where nothing ever happens, almost expressing a distaste for an afterlife where the tension of living on Earth, the give and the take of everyday living would be missing. The grooves on this album generally range from incredibly hard and physical, like on Life During Wartime, whose "this ain't no party, this ain't no disco" refrain still stands as one of Talking Heads' best hooks. And then there's the crushing and hypnotic Memories Can Wait, which is easily one of the most nightmarish songs of the 70s, with its twisted synths and heavy guitars and booming drums, all gaining this frightening quality because of David Byrne's disembodied screams and howls in the background. It's like he's trapped in a never-ending free fall down a spiraling abyss. The song Animals is eyebrow-raising and paranoid, with these layered lead vocals that sound gigantic, almost like a voice has gotten into my head and is controlling my thoughts. With all of these manic and paranoid ramblings about animals laughing at you, or I guess judging. Again, it's weird and freakish and completely irrational, but these are feelings and emotions and mentalities that Talking Heads tend to embrace and highlight. There are a couple of spots on this album that feel kind of typical or plain for Talking Heads at this point, mostly the song Paper, or the song Electric Guitar, which to me musically and topically is pretty much a dud. Still a fantastic album though, and a great next chapter in the Talking Heads catalog, so don't miss this one. Next on the list, second best, in my opinion, is the Talking Heads' 1983 album Speaking in Tongues, a record that brought some pretty significant benchmarks for the band. This record is essentially the first that they would record and release after splitting off from Brian Eno after Remain in Light. This record also brought the band's first top 10 hit with the track Burning Down the House. The record pretty much went 2 times platinum over the years, and the album would essentially set the stage for the tour on which the band would record Stop Making Sense. And this record is really truly Talking Heads' first big commercial breakthrough. Yes, imagine a time in the music industry where it literally took a band this long to have a top 10 hit, and they came out with album after album after album after album, and the record label didn't kick them or anything. Now, it's not hard to see why that song and this album would be as popular as it is. The whole thing slaps. This thing is like 80s dance rock bangers. The grooves on this thing are tight, they're layered, they're overwhelming. They're huge. Killer bass lines and drums, great pacing. The rhythm section on this thing is colored beautifully with sticky guitar lines and synth leads, or experimental noisy bits like on tracks such as Girlfriend is Better. The sounds that Talking Heads are playing with on this album are nothing entirely new, but I think the band hit this supreme moment of clarity with the writing, performance, and production on this record, where pretty much everything about the band's style and music sounds so effortless and natural. There are also lots of large and bold vocal sections on this record too. David Byrne brings some excellent vocal performances. The whole album is a great balance of incredibly weird but supremely catchy. Talking Heads' usual nervous energy is really working to their benefit here, especially on cuts like Slippery People. The band also takes a huge risk on the song Swamp, which is kind of like their take on some southern lowdown rock and roll ZZ Top style. Also, This Must Be the Place is seen as one of the band's best songs, period. As the rudimentary instrumentation of the track is pretty cute, David Byrne's vocals are very passionate, and generally the sentiments of the song are heartwarming. The album is pretty much incredible and is one of the band's most consistent and solid and just mind blowing up records, period. Ugh. Next. Finally, my favorite Talking Heads album, in my opinion, the best Talking Heads album, their 1980 record, Remain in Light. The third album the band would record with none other than Brian Eno. Features excellent tracks such as Born Under Punches and, of course, Once in a Lifetime. This is easily one of the most cutting-edge albums in rock music and dance music and pop music. The way the band recorded it in the digital fashion that they did, pulling some of the musical bits of this record and sort of working them into loops, was totally, like, oh my God, who the fuck else was doing that? Also, the way that David Byrne and company incorporated Afrobeat into their repertoire on this record too was pretty game-changing. Pretty much like on Speaking in Tongues, the songwriting quality, the production quality, the performance quality, it's all very, very high. But Remain in Light, in my opinion, has the added benefit of sounding like a futuristic fusion, still sounding pretty futuristic today, in my opinion, of, again, rock music, disco music, funk music, electronic music, Afrobeat. David Byrne not sounding quite as smooth as he does on some points of Speaking in Tongues, though, but in a good way. He's much more erratic by comparison on this album, and I think, again, that's kind of a benefit to the record's dark, strange, alien, and, again, futuristic vibe, aesthetic. It's for these reasons and more that when I did a classic review a little while back, I kind of jumped on top of the opportunity to talk about this record. I highly recommend that you try to watch that review as well to kind of get my full thoughts on this record, because I do think it's absolutely amazing. I do think it's absolutely excellent and very well deserving of the top placement in this worst to best list. And that's pretty much all I have to say. Awesome. Hopefully you guys got a lot of great stuff out of this video. Hopefully you are no longer hesitant to jump into this discography if you have not yet. And if you've already heard all of Talking Heads stuff, please let me know down in the comments what your favorite albums of theirs are and how you would stack them up from worst to best. Cool. Cool. Mwah. Love you, love you, love you. Transition. Have you given all of these albums a listen? If not, I hope so. Talking Heads, Anthony Fantano, worst to best. Over here next to my head is the other worst to best videos, the playlist, and the button to subscribe. Yep. Forever.